So this will take a second to load. In my mind, the Battle of Fredericksburg is really an example of poor planning by the Union Army, and it shows us that the Union Army was not really taking the Confederacy seriously. So looking at the two sides, leading the Union Army is General Ambrose Burnside, rather. And we have the famous general from Virginia, who very much proves to be a Confederate hero, Robert E. Lee, defending the capital at Richmond. So the strategy was for the Union Army to launch a frontal assault upon the Confederate Army. So the problem was that, first off, the Confederate Army was pretty well protected, and they were taking pretty strong measures to defend Richmond, since Richmond was the new capital of the Confederacy. So really, I think that the Union Army thought that it was going to have a much easier time seizing Richmond, and then they were sadly mistaken. So ultimately, at the end of the Battle of Fredericksburg, it's a 4-day battle in 1862, you're going to have a Confederate victory. Now, with that said, just notice something. The Confederates technically won the battle, but notice that in terms of casualties, the Confederates still did take a hit, right? In particular, look at the wounding rate of the Confederates, but still, by comparison, the Union suffered far more casualties, hence the Confederate victory. But what's interesting here is this second point where it says that this is a defensive war of attrition. So basically, a war of attrition is one where you are ultimately willing to face damage from your own army in order to defeat the enemy. We're going to see this employed by both sides, and this is a strategy that the Union's going to use much more as we get closer to the end of the war. But essentially, the idea is that losing people in battle is okay if ultimately the other side loses more. So really, with the battle of attrition, you're not afraid of having casualties. Another thing that's interesting with Fredericksburg and with other battles in the Civil War was that there's no real dividing line between what makes a Confederate and what makes an American soldier. And so in this battle, we know that there were people on the battlefront. And another thing is that we have the Irish who are actually fighting for both the Confederacy and for the Union Army. And that's interesting because you're going to see that the Irish actually come out as some of the biggest opponents of the war. So needless to say, with the Confederate victory, it very much looks like this war is not going to be quick. So just like we discussed with the Battle of First Bull Run, Fredericksburg is yet another check on the Union's confidence, and it's going to make them realize that they can't just very quickly seize Richmond, rather. They're going to have to go about it a different way. So the Peninsular Campaign, as we call it, which were the battles that we already discussed, I just wanted to show you, it's the Peninsular Campaign because ultimately we are fighting for this chunk of land. They're fighting for Richmond, and there is a peninsula on the eastern shore of Maryland and on Virginia that a lot of the fighting took place on. Let's get back here. Excuse me. Okay, so moving on. After Fredericksburg, one of the bloodiest battles in the Civil War, the Battle of Antietam. So let's move forward here. Okay, so Antietam takes place later that same year, and Antietam goes down in history as the bloodiest battle in the Civil War. There were 23,000 casualties just on this one day of battle. And the reason why this matters is because even though the Unions technically won this conflict, the only reason why the Union won was because they were able to lose more soldiers, but the South didn't have the same sort of numbers to back their military up. So really, both sides effectively lose the Battle of Antietam. So really, when historians look back on it, even if it was a Union victory, technically, it's an inconclusive result. All right, so it's considered a strategic Union victory because there were so many Confederate casualties. And what really matters is that it gives Abraham Lincoln confidence. And so what Lincoln is going to do shortly after Antietam is he's going to announce the Emancipation Proclamation. This, so to speak, victory allows him to do that. what we see also is that the Southern strategy is failing. What they're attempting to do, and I'll show you where Antietam is, it's in Maryland, so we're looking at a slightly farther north territory compared to the other battles. Lee is hoping that if he successfully wins in Antietam, that he might be able to push his troops farther north. And if he gets too close to Washington, D.C., then ultimately that could lead to a Confederate victory, and it could lead to the Union from surrendering. The other thing is the South thought that if they won this battle, that Great Britain would join them as allies. So when they lose that guarantee, right? Another battle that takes place in the following spring of 1863 that we should just keep on our radar, but I don't have many notes on it, so that kind of gives you a sense in general of the order of operations here. But this is the Battle of Chancellorsville. And this also we're going to see is, this one is interesting because the Confederacy is vastly outnumbered. Robert E. Lee is facing a Union army that is twice its size, but nonetheless, the Confederacy wins. So this is seen as a huge embarrassment for the Union because they have so many more soldiers, and yet the Confederacy still beats them. So there are some people who are martyred in this battle as well. We talked about Stonewall Jackson as the man standing like a stone wall to defend the Confederacy before the Battle of First Bull Run. By the time we get to Chancellorsville, Stonewall Jackson ends up dying, but it's actually ironic because he ends up getting shot by his own men accidentally. And when he dies, it definitely puts a cloud over the victory in Chancellorsville. There's the death of, to the Confederacy, a major hero that they don't feel is replaceable. So that, if we look back to the last video where we discussed advantages and disadvantages of the North and South, since the South had one advantage being the quality of military leaders, when one of them dies, then that's a huge weakness for them. So like I was saying earlier, the major importance after Chancellorsville is that, or not just Chancellorsville, I apologize, it's also after Antietam, that Abraham Lincoln gets the confidence that he needs to issue one of the most important decisions that turns the tide of the war. And this is the Emancipation Proclamation. So I stand corrected. I just wanted to, I want to make sure that I'm clear on dates. Chancellorsville takes place after the Emancipation Proclamation, okay? It's Antietam that is the battle that prompts the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation takes effect on New Year's Day of 1863. And so this is what it does. It actually says, according to Lincoln, that all of the states that are in rebellion, so in other words, the states that have seceded, those are the slaves that are going to be freed. Okay, so if we look at the secession, or the seceded states, in fact, I think that this is really the best map that we could use. Remember that we're dealing with the areas that have left the Union, all right? So Maryland doesn't. West Virginia doesn't, right? Kentucky takes a while. Virginia does, right? But ultimately what we're seeing is these in-between areas that never seceded, they don't get their, they don't have to worry about losing their slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation was only meant to affect the states that had already seceded, right? So that meant that a state like Kentucky that had not yet seceded is not going to want to secede because it still is allowed to hold slaves. The whole reason why Lincoln does this is because he wants to further punish the southern states. The thing that's tricky about emancipation is there's one thing if you issue the Emancipation Proclamation, it's yet another thing to enforce it. So really what we see is that there are going to be some slaves that don't end up going far after the Emancipation Proclamation. But the reason why this matters is because the tide of war changes now. When Lincoln ran for president in 1860, he was claiming that he was just going to prevent slavery from expanding further west. And now here he is 2 years later, effectively freeing slaves in more than half of the country. So there are a few reasons, again, why he would do this. Like we said earlier, he wants to punish the southern states. He also wants to make it so that the former slaves who are living in these states have an opportunity to, A, leave the areas where they were enslaved for such a long time, and B, possibly join the army and fight for the Union. So it gave Abraham Lincoln even more soldiers, right? So really, this is going to encourage more slaves to seek freedom. And eventually, we're going to see that the Emancipation Proclamation is going to go one step further. And after the war, it will have the 13th Amendment be ratified, which ends all slavery. So this is really an important change for Lincoln because he's really changing his approach towards being more abolitionist and less moderate. All right, so the next year, we really start to see a turn in battle. So Gettysburg is seen as one of the major turning points of the Civil War. If we think about where Gettysburg is located, I didn't mean to X out of that, no worries. Once we pull back up a map here, it's really important to look at the location and why that matters for Robert E. Lee's strategy. So here we go. Going back to a map to show you what we're talking about here. Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania. It's located about 8 miles north of the Maryland border. So Robert E. Lee's idea is to start to push into Northern Territory. And if Robert E. Lee scored a victory in Gettysburg, the idea would be that he could presumably go farther north and continue to weaken the Union. And also, eventually, his idea was to double back and end up in Washington, D.C., and then force the Union to surrender. So he really wants to move into Northern Territory because then he can really weaken the Union force, right? So this is the second time after Antietam that the Confederates actually are pushing into Northern Territory. So Lee really wants, first off, the opportunity to make an aggressive move. At this point, the Confederates are ultimately facing some serious problems. They don't have enough supplies. Part of this is because of the lack of transportation throughout the South. Another thing is that as the war starts to turn its tide, there are going to be more Confederate deserters from the army. So Lee is still ultimately making this really aggressive strategy, which may sort of backfire on him because when we have a Confederate defeat in Gettysburg, that's only going to discourage the Confederate cause that much more. So again, like I was saying before, Lee's whole plan is to go into the North and then eventually get the Union to sue for peace. They're also really hoping to secure a European ally because at this point, countries like Britain and France are sort of just watching this conflict and they're not sure what the best strategy is. They still very much rely on the South for their cotton exports, but they don't support the South's continuation of slavery. So a victory on either side in Gettysburg could really affect their European alliances. So the Battle of Gettysburg is actually a 3-day long affair, and it's going to result ultimately in a Union victory. These details are really more for Civil War aficionados, for people who are really interested in the military elements. I'm not too concerned about some of these specifics showing up on the AP exam. But just know that this was a pretty chunky battle. There were many soldiers that fought, 160,000. Gettysburg actually had a shoe factory in it, so this was also an opportunity. One of the reasons why the battle took place there instead of another location was that the hope was that the soldiers would be able to get new shoes while they were there. So notice that the Confederates ultimately are going to start off the battle by just pushing slightly, trying to pick away at the Union forces. The second day of battle, there's a harder push, so the Confederates are really amping up their efforts. And on the third day, we have an attempt to basically onslaught the Union forces, an event called Pickett's Charge, which actually ends up to be a complete disaster, which we'll look at a little bit more in a second. So anyway, like I was saying, the Union is a huge victor at the end of this battle. It's not as bloody as Antietam, but it's one of the bloodiest battles. Remember, Antietam, we lost 23,000 in basically an hour of battle. This is a 3-day long affair, and we have 7,500 casualties, but then we also have a number of other people who leave because of attrition, and also we're not entirely sure of all the numbers because some people went missing. So in any case, what this means is that there's not going to be any other time when the Confederate Army tries to push so far north. After the Battle of Gettysburg, the rest of the fighting takes place south of the Mason-Dixon line. And so really what this means is no longer is there a Southern advantage, so to speak, in the war. They don't have that same kind of war spirit anymore. And so it's going to turn into a major war of attrition where from here on out, the Union is just going to try to pick apart and destroy the Southern Army to get them to surrender. I promised to mention Pickett's charge a little bit more, and I did not. So Pickett's charge was led by General Pickett of the Confederate Army, and essentially he makes one of the, in my mind, the dumbest decisions in military strategy that I've ever heard of, and that was to line up all of his soldiers and have them race across an open battlefield to attack the Union Army waiting on the other side. So essentially, this is like having a whole group of people running across a football field and letting all the people in the audience facing them have super soaker pistols and open fire. The idea was that everyone involved in Pickett's charge became an easy target, and when there were so many casualties just in this one offensive movement, it was that much more of a blow to the confidence of the Confederate Army. So it was a really poor military decision. In addition to the battle itself, the Gettysburg Address not only is one of the most eloquent and beautiful speeches in U.S. history, but it really shows us, in Lincoln's words, what the purpose of the war is. This speech is very short. It was less than 2 minutes. Lincoln was not even the headliner. There were other speakers at this event. And so ultimately what Lincoln is doing when he is giving the Gettysburg Address is he's honoring the people that had lost their lives earlier that year in the Battle of Gettysburg. He talks quite a bit about how the people who died shall not have died in vain, but rather they are fighting for the Union which was formed back in 1787. The Union that was created for the people, by the people, and of the people. So he's referring specifically back to the Constitution in the speech. And the idea is that he wants to redefine what that freedom means, right? And so for him, he is going back to these original documents, but he wants to extend the people that these documents are talking about. To Lincoln now, all citizens apply to the freedoms that were guaranteed by the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But it also just has a really good reputation of being a beautiful speech, and Lincoln was known for his strong oratory skills. So just an image of Lincoln going towards the platform to give his speech. Okay, so let's talk about what is happening in the West now, because what we're going to see is that the Union Army actually has a much easier time defeating the Confederacy in the West. Seems like it takes a little while for the Union to catch up with the Confederacy in those northern battles that we discussed earlier. All right, so by the time we get to Vicksburg, we're going to have the emergence of a new and very powerful leader of the Union Army, and that is General Ulysses S. Grant, who will later become a president, right? So Ulysses S. Grant's strategy is to defeat Vicksburg and then ultimately tear the Confederacy in half. There are going to be all these areas that are west of the Mississippi River that would be completely cut off from the rest of the Confederacy if the Union got control of the river. So that's exactly what's going to happen. In Vicksburg, Grant is going to be very successful. They're actually going to not only secure a victory in Vicksburg, but then later they're going to capture Chattanooga, Tennessee. Eventually, the Union Army is also going to occupy New Orleans. They are going to free the slaves that they come across there, which is, again, going to weaken the Confederacy. So what happens that's really significant here is that when the Confederacy loses in Vicksburg, the North gets control of navigating the Mississippi River. And like this point here says, that effectively divides the Confederacy into two parts. Every western part of the Confederacy is now completely cut off from the east. No supplies can be exchanged. You can't reinforce the Confederate battle with soldiers from the west. It's a really bad sign for the Confederacy. Forgive me, I think I have a ghost. So, because Grant is clearly a talented military leader with his performance in Vicksburg, we're going to have a major change in command, and Ulysses S. Grant is going to be put in charge of the Union Army at this point. Now, the previous general, George McClellan, was fired by Abraham Lincoln before this. And so McClellan actually is very much not fighting, but disagreeing quite a bit about strategy with Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln was very much emerging as an active commander-in-chief. So because there were a number of times when McClellan would not do what Lincoln asked him to, it's logical that Lincoln switched his leading general to Grant instead of McClellan. So Grant was much more aggressive. McClellan was always hesitant to actually launch a full-scale attack on Richmond or anywhere else. And Lincoln's argument was that hesitation was actually hurting them. So Grant's tactic is much more just fight and ultimately destroy the South. It's very much a strategy of attrition because Grant suffers a lot of casualties on his own side, but he doesn't really care about that. His idea is he will let as many of his soldiers die as he has to, so long as at the end he's going to get the Confederacy to surrender. So what we're seeing here is that first off, the Union is higher in numbers, so Grant takes advantage of that. Many people thought that Grant was unnecessarily violent, but really what's interesting is that in some ways Grant has a very different strategy from McClellan because battles tended to be fairly well spaced apart, which allowed the soldiers to actually sort of restock and recover after a major battle. But ultimately, despite this strategy, the costs for the Union Army were sky high. But ultimately, what really matters is that Grant is going to chase down Lee and get him to surrender over time. All right, so this is kind of overkill here, but what we're going to see is that there's just going to be these number of battles that take place after Grant comes in charge, where you're going to see a pretty significant example of how attrition works. So in the Battle of Cold Harbor, the idea for Grant, again, is that strategy of attrition. And it very much proves to be the case. You see that with the numbers. The Union loses 7,000 troops in this one battle. The Confederates end up, their casualty rate it's 1,500 in total, but only 83 of those people actually died. So we're including injuries in that count. So the reason why this matters is you see that Grant really doesn't care that he lost so many soldiers. He just wants to keep launching attacks on the Confederacy. What's even more interesting is Grant's strategy in Georgia. So this is the march from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia. Grant's going to send this man here, William Tecumseh Sherman, to march from Atlanta, Georgia to Savannah, and he orders him to burn everything in his path. This is a strategy called scorched earth, and ultimately the idea is to completely destroy the Southern economy, to essentially evoke total war in the region, getting men, women, and children involved by destroying their property. The idea is to basically try to encourage Lee to surrender because so much damage is done to this area, right? So this is total war at its finest, or maybe not so finest, but the idea is that there's no civilian that is excluded from the war because of this really aggressive campaign. So here is the marching path that you can see here, right? William Tecumseh Sherman's march from Atlanta to Savannah. You also see a number of other campaigns that are taking place, all ultimately working towards weakening the South. So again, Sherman's march to the sea. This is that march from Atlanta to Savannah. What we see again is that this is a really good example of total war. He basically works to burn every town that he comes across. He pillages and loots towns when he can. And it takes years for the South to recover all the infrastructure that it loses. What this is also going to do is it's just going to ruin the South's spirit and willpower. They don't want to fight when their towns are in complete disarray, when they can no longer make any livelihood. To them, they just want to return back to normal. So really, this is not just an effort to try to get the South to get someone like Lee to surrender. It's also to kind of destroy the spirit of the war, so to speak. Then when we come to the next election, we see how divided the country is. Well, first off, there's one thing that we need to acknowledge before we even discuss that. All of these states that are in, I guess, tan, brown, these are all states that seceded from the Union, right? So these states don't get to vote in the presidential election. Notice that there are no numbers next to them. So the only states that are voting are the states with numbers. Those numbers represent their electoral votes. So notice that with this election, almost half of the country is excluded. Since they are in secession, they don't get voting rights, right? So really what this does is this really damages the possibility for a Democratic candidate or anyone who has a more moderate or, I guess, conservative approach towards slavery. The person who runs against Lincoln is Lincoln's former war general, McClellan, the man that Lincoln actually fired, right? McClellan wants to end the war immediately, but Lincoln doesn't want to let the war end before the South actually surrenders. And also, at this point, Lincoln's strategy has changed to be one that is much more aggressive against slavery. So, essentially, because the people who are voting are all in the North, they support Lincoln's anti-slavery approach, and they think that McClellan, by ending the war prematurely, would be too kind to the South. So Lincoln is going to win pretty handily. I mean, he gets 55% of the popular vote, and then in terms of the electoral vote, there's no question, 212 electoral votes to 21. So eventually, all things come to an end, and the cat and mouse race between Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee is going to end in a fairly small town called Appomattox, Virginia. So essentially, this war of attrition is going to work. Grant, even though he lost approximately 300,000 soldiers in about 6 months of conflict, still got what he wanted. The Confederate Army was weak enough at this point that Lee agrees to surrender, and this happens in the courthouse in Appomattox, Virginia. Ultimately, there are some guarantees that the Confederates get that we're going to see will be re-examined once we get into the Reconstruction period, but ultimately, these are the things that the Confederates get at first. They're really afraid that they're going to be treated as traitors or war criminals by the U.S. government, and so that's one thing that is agreed upon in this surrender. But eventually, we're going to see that there are going to be some more radical people in Congress that want to take that away. The other thing was that the Confederate soldiers were allowed to take their horses back with them. So they didn't completely lose all of their property, one could say. So on the one hand, it shows us really that the last 6 months of the war were kind of unnecessary in a lot of ways. It was a war, at this point, it was a series of battles over confidence. And once Grant picked away at the Southern confidence, both by chasing Lee and also by setting fire to quite a bit of the South, he finally got what he wanted. But the celebration at the end of the war does not last very long, right? Because very, very shortly, literally only, It is 2 days after the war ends, Lincoln's going to be assassinated, right? He is in Ford's Theater trying to have a nice, relaxing night in, and a hired actor, John Wilkes Booth, is going to sneak in and shoot Lincoln, and he is going to not die instantly. He's actually going to be taken across the street, and he dies several hours later. Booth ends up getting away with it. And what we're going to see now is that despite the fact that the Union is victorious in the war, Lincoln had a very clear strategy for how he was going to repair the relationship between the North and South after the war. We're going to talk about that in the next section, Lincoln's Reconstruction Plan. But when Lincoln dies, that means that we have to have a new executive to actually carry out these Reconstruction policies. And Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson, was not nearly as popular, and he tended to have much less forgiving views on slaves than Lincoln did. So we'll see how that pans out when the time comes. One other thing to note is that Booth, while he did kill Lincoln, there were also plots to kill Vice President Johnson and the Secretary of State. So if that had happened, you can see how large scale that degree of assassinating not only the vice president and the president would mean that it would leave the state of the White House in utter chaos, right? And so basically the South, knowing that it had lost the war, ultimately was trying to weaken the Union where they thought it was strongest, and that was within the White House. So that is the end of our discussion about the Civil War. Really, what I want us to focus on is the series of turning points. So we're going to talk a little bit more about why things like the Emancipation Proclamation, Gettysburg, are so significant. I want to zoom in a little bit more on the role of blacks in the military, because that's a very interesting and meaningful part of this history. But in order to get us to move very quickly through this unit, I wanted to give a video lecture so that we can focus on very specific analysis in class and spend a little bit less time on broad content overview. So I'll tell you the page numbers that correspond with this, and I'm also going to give you a shorter version of reading so that you don't have to plow through a thick textbook. So please ask questions if you're still confused about any elements of the war, and I hope you have a great weekend. Okay, thanks.